Hello, I'm Tracy Nicholas, and welcome to Folkloring. I am a passionate folklore practitioner, and to me, folkloring is more than just a podcast. It's my commitment to help you connect with your roots and awaken the wisdom within you.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to this episode of Folkloring, which is about weather divination. But before I get into it, I want to tell you how I've been folkloring lately. The first thing that I want to tell you is that it was just solstice, and so got together with a group of friends and did a short ritual to celebrate that, which was a lot of fun. So I really enjoyed that. Another thing was I had some friends over and I made mulled wine. And I don't always do that, but if I am going to do it, I always do it around Christmas time. And it's really nice. It's cozy, it's warm. I love it. And the final thing, as we have been leading up to Christmas, this year I decided to do an Advent calendar, which I don't normally do, but it was quite a bit of fun. There were a couple of days where I skipped or forgot, but then you get a bonus on the day that you go back and remember, and you get more than one. So that's how I have been folkloring lately. Now, about weather divination. There are a lot of sayings, superstitions, and beliefs around trying to predict what the weather is going to be. And again, this makes a lot of sense because in an agricultural society, that is really important to whether people are going to have enough abundance to get them through the year. And so, of course, there's a lot of lore about it, as we see with anything that people need for their survival. Now, there's three different kinds of weather lore. The first of these is observational sayings. Now, these are based on the appearance of the clouds or the sky or maybe some other natural phenomenon. And they're primarily used to predict short-term weather changes over the next couple of days or what have you. There are seasonal sayings, and these sayings are about sort of general characteristics of specific seasons, and these often predict how severe the weather's going to be in the upcoming season. And then there are weather predictions and superstitions. And these are based on beliefs that certain events or occurrences can foretell changes in the weather. And so some of the general sayings, observational sayings about weather, observational and seasonal, probably you've heard. Things like red sky at night, sailor's delight. And it's interesting because if there is a red sky at sunset, that is often a sign that there's high pressure and stable air coming in from the west, which typically means that there's good weather ahead. Then there's March comes in like a lion, goes out like a lamb. And this saying is based on the idea that, March typically begins with harsh weather, winter-like weather, but ends with milder spring-like conditions. I don't know if that's necessarily true where I live. It seems like we don't really start having the milder weather until the end of April, beginning of May, but that's the basic idea there. Then there's when the wind is from the west, then the weather's at its best. And again, westerly winds often bring mild, pleasant weather. For some people, they originate over the ocean, have a moderating effect on temperatures. So those are just some general sayings. Now, some of the seasonal sayings, again, I've heard a lot of these, but there is some basis in reality as to why these things are true. The first one is for springtime. April showers bring May flowers. And this is just a reminder to people that the rainy days of spring are necessary for the growth of, the early flowers that are popping up. Then there is one, if the first week in April is foggy, rain in June will make lanes boggy. And this kind of implies that foggy weather in early April is going to lead to a wet and muddy June. A couple of summer sayings. First one, dog days bright and clear indicate a happy year. And this refers to the dog days of summer. And these are often associated with really hot weather. And bright, clear dog days is considered to be a sign that there's a prosperous year ahead. And I do wonder if it's just because that makes a great growing season. Then we have a swarm of bees in May is worth a load of hay. And this is about how important honeybees as pollinators are and the impact that they have on agricultural productivity. Moving to the autumn, a warm October, a cold February. Now, this is saying if it's mild in the fall, it may be followed by a harsh and cold winter. Another one, when leaves fall early, fall and winter will be mild. When they fall late, winter will be severe. And so according to this, timing of the leaves falling can predict the severity of the upcoming winter, which I don't see it. I've seen a lot of years where there's a terrible cold snap and some of the leaves never even dropped. So I'm not sure on that one. Now for the winter, a green Christmas, a white Easter. And obviously, again, this is implying that if it's, snowless at Christmas, it could be that the season is pushing a little later and it'll still be snowy in, around Easter time. Then we have, if there's ice in November that will bear a duck, there'll be nothing after but sludge and muck. And this is a warning that an early cold snap might be followed by a wet and muddy winter. So, there's a little contradiction here about what's going on. But those were the sayings that I found. Now, there are sayings and superstitions connected with the moon. And I think that these are a little bit more based in some sort of reality as well. First one, a ring around the moon and it will rain real soon. Now, a moon ring indicates that there is an approaching weather storm. And so this is saying that it's probably that, precipitation is going to come quickly, right? Then we have, if the moon shows a silver shield, be not afraid to reap your field. And a bright, clear moon without a halo is seen as a sign of good weather, indicating that it's safe to continue with, agricultural tasks, what have you. Okay, so those are just some basic general sayings. Now to move on to other ways of predicting what the weather is going to be. And I'm going to start with animals. And obviously, in the US, one of the most famous is Groundhog Day. Now, the Groundhog Day has its origins in Europe, although there weren't groundhogs there. Now, it was originally based on Candlemas, which is 6 weeks after Christmas and between the spring equinox and the summer solstice. And historically, it had a lot of symbolic meaning, commemorating Mary bringing Jesus to the Temple of Jerusalem. But historically, the holiday also celebrated the planting of crops upcoming. Now, over time, it started to evolve into a weather predicting event where different animals would serve as weather forecasters to determine the best time to sow the fields. Now, according to the Farmer's Almanac, this job went to bears in France and England, and in Germany, it was badgers. So in the 1800s, when German immigrants started coming and settling in Pennsylvania, they wanted to continue their traditions, but there were no badgers. But there were groundhogs. So the job fell to the groundhog. One of the most famous groundhogs is Puxatawney Phil, which, of course, the movie Groundhog Day was based on. And the reason for that is that one of the first mentions of Groundhog Day was in the Puxatawney Spirit, which was a local newspaper. Now, this happened in 1886, which is important because the claim on the website that is about Puxatawney Phil, it claims that it's been one groundhog continuously this whole time. So that would be a groundhog that lived, coming up on 150 years now. And the average groundhog's lifespan is maybe 2 to 3 years. So a little hard to believe that it's always been the same one. What I find interesting about Groundhog Day is that the legend goes that if the groundhog does see its shadow, that means more bad weather coming up. And it reminds me of the lore of the Cailleach. And the story there is that by the beginning of February, the Cailleach's supply of firewood is running short. So she has to go out and get more. And if the weather is sunny and clear on February 1st, it means that she has made the day a very nice day so she can collect lots of wood. And if the day is stormy or overcast, it means that she slept in and that she will run out of firewood soon, and so the winter's going to have to end pretty soon. So I like that that's both the same kind of reason of if it's a good day, there's going to be a lot more winter. Now, of course, where I come from, it would be ridiculous to think that at the beginning of February, there's not going to be 6 more weeks of winter. But again, maybe that's just where I live. In other places, that's not as true. Now, there are some rivals to Phil. In Pennsylvania alone, we have Mountjoy Minnie, Grover, Poor Richard, Lawrenceville Lucy, Mount Gretna Grady, Poppy, who interestingly appeared alongside Bill Murray in a Jeep commercial back in 2020, Susquehanna Sherman, Tinnakin Tim, one called Uni, which is a taxidermied groundhog named after the Union Canal. And this particular one is towed down the Tulpehogan Creek in a tiny boat to make that prediction. We also have in Quarryville, Pennsylvania, Orphy the Magnanimous, also known as Octorero Orphy. And they call Orphy a reclusive oracle. And Orphy is also taxidermied, and he's mounted wearing a tiny top hat and occasionally a bow tie. And his followers, who call themselves the hibernating governors of the slumbering groundhog lodge, they believe that he's the one true groundhog. And in addition to performing skits and dancing something called the groundhog jig, new members to the lodge will be outfitted with man-sized infant bonnets and given pacifiers for their baby year in an annual initiation rite. In other places, other animals take up this job. In Beaumont, Texas, for example, you have Big Al, who is a 91-year-old 1,000-pound alligator who lives at a place called Gator Country Adventure Park and Sanctuary. And they've got more than 450 alligators there. And what this prediction is based on is whether or not Big Al eats chicken. Originally, it was eats chicken. Apparently, they've gone past that now because Big Al is so popular, so he gets a nice steak at dinner now. The way that it works is one of the trainers will get in the water with Big Al and get him to open his mouth, and then they'll throw the steak in his mouth. And if he spits it out, that means 6 more weeks of winter. So, similarly, there is in East Fort, Connecticut, a duck that takes the job, and the duck is called Scramble. And the believers there say that ducks are superior to groundhog for a few reasons. And first, they spend time in the weather instead of hiding underground like the groundhog does. And ducks will commonly play in kind of stormy weather, and so they also have a sense of weather patterns for their migration purposes. Some people believe that the patterns of the stripes on the woolly bear caterpillar, who is also called a fuzzy bear, sometimes a hedgehog caterpillar, and it's said that those stripes predict the severity of the oncoming winter. And if the stripes are wide, that means the winter will be severe. And if the middle brown segments look broader, you can expect a milder winter. In South Carolina, they even have a ghost that can predict hurricanes. He's called the Gray Man, and it's believed that he appears in a small town of Pawleys Island. And it is an island, but it's not off the coast of South Carolina. It's just a river that separates it. So, like a lot of ghost stories, there is some disagreement about the details and the surrounding events that created the Gray Man. But the basic story is that there was a man who was returning to his love on Pawleys Island after a long time away, but he unfortunately died in quicksand before arriving. And since that time, it's said that he appears shortly before hurricanes as a signal that it's time to leave the island. And it's also believed that he helps to preserve the homes of those that he meets along the way. And the belief here is if someone was passing by, the Gray Man would be drawn to that person and follow them to their home, believing that the house belonged to his sweetheart. And that's why he protects that home. Now, some tellings have the Gray Man first appearing in 1822, but then there are other stories that have it starting later. And there's a Confederate soldier that's returning home from the war in 1865. So, as I said earlier, some minor discrepancy as you see as these stories kind of change and shift over time. Moving along to a different kind of oracle, looking at German folklore, we have an onion oracle. And you do this on New Year's. And you peel back the onion's layers after slicing it lengthwise down the middle. And then you lay 12 sections out side by side, and you top each with some salt. And how the onion slice reacts to the salt overnight foretells how wet or dry each month will be in the upcoming year. And they're examined in order, and the first represents January and second is February and so on. And some pieces were left with dry salt, indicating a dry month, and if there's a briny liquid in the center, it indicates heavy rain or snow, and caked or crusty salt meant frost, and bubbles hinted at humidity. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this process later when we talk about folkloring in general. Moving to Ireland, there's a lot of weather lore. Now, some of this stuff might be found in other places in the UK as well, but these are all going to be found in Ireland. Between Christmas and St. Bridget's Day, people expected the worst weather of the year for obvious reasons. Now, a February that was mild indicated to them that the weather for the next year was going to be bad. And if a cuckoo was heard while the trees were still bare of leaves, it was a belief that there was going to be a lean harvest that year. For them, a ring around the moon indicated a coming storm, and swallows that were flying low were thought to be a sign of upcoming rain. And it was believed that seagulls flying inland signified that storms were coming. They thought that when a cat ate grass or turned its back to the fire, that might be a sign of rain. And rain was also predicted if the cattle would lay down in the fields or if they stood with their backs to the hedges. Continuing to move through the year, it was generally believed that from St. Patrick's Day forward, the weather was going to keep getting better and better, and the early sowing of some crops could begin, and this was also known as the spring sowing. But sometimes the weather would turn cold again at the beginning of April, as we know it can do. And this is known in Ireland as the borrowed days. And it relates to a folk tale of the old brindled cow, which is a native Irish breed. And they're known for their distinctive striped coats. Now, in this folk tale, the cow boasted that the weather in the month of March couldn't kill her, even if it was harsh. And so once March heard this, March went to April and borrowed 3 days from April and unleashed such terrible weather that it killed the cow and also skinned her as well. And so this story is a cautionary tale to not get too used to really good weather if it starts to come early, because it can go back to being winter again very quickly. On May 1st, the weather was observed for signs of what the rest of the summer would bring. Frost on May Day was considered a very bad sign, as was any cold wind. And it was believed that a windy and wet May means that a good harvest was in store. And the saying that went with this was, "A wet and windy May fills the barns with corn and hay." So wind on May 1st, bad. Wind the rest of the month, apparently good. Now, July 15th, which is St. Swithin's Day, was very important for predicting weather. It was believed that if it rained on that day, then the next 40 days would also be rainy. But if the conditions were good, the next 40 days would be clear. The legend behind this is that St. Swithin was a very humble man, and there was a very fancy memorial erected in his honor. And he was so outraged by this that he made it rain until his followers took it down. So that is the way that story goes. Even though Swithin was an English saint, the custom was observed in Ireland and was believed to be a great way to predict the weather. Moving back to the U.S., in the Appalachian Mountains, there are a lot of different superstitions around predicting the weather. There's a story that if cows are laying down in their fields, it means that rain is on the way. And we heard the same thing in Ireland. So it's very interesting because, as far as I can tell, there's no actual connection in the real world to that being true. If a rooster crows in the middle of the night, that would be foretelling rain coming the next day. If dogs start to run in circles for no reason, that means bad weather is coming. And if birds build their nest closer to the ground than they usually do, that's predicting that a harsh winter is on the way. There's also a belief that crickets can tell the temperature, and it works like this. You count the number of chirps that happen in 15 seconds, and then you add that to 37. Some people say it's 40, but it gives you a rough idea. And weirdly enough, this actually does work because it's not precise, but you'll kind of land within a few degrees because crickets are cold-blooded. In the cooler weather, their activity levels will drop. And so, the movement that creates that chirping sound increases in warm temperatures and, decreases in the cold. It only works between around 55 to 100 degrees Fahrenheit, though. Outside of those temperatures, it's not really anything that you can count on. I also found an interesting story out of Chicago. In the winter of 1903-1904, it apparently was a very harsh winter, and it's one of the coldest that had ever happened in Chicago up until then. Now, there was a man who didn't live in Chicago, but his name was Joe Harris, and he claimed that he could see it coming. And so he kept saying it's going to be this really cold winter, prepare for it. And so eventually, at the end of November of 1903, there was a Chicago newspaper called the Inter-Ocean and said, all right, we're going to round up what they called weather sharps who predicted how the upcoming weather was going to be. And so they brought a bunch in and they saw different signs and they all said, yes, it's going to be a very harsh winter. One of them said that it was because of top-heavy turkeys whose breastbones are of double strength, and that was a sign of upcoming cold weather. Another one saw proof in evergreen trees that were heavy with a lot of extra foliage. Some pointed to fish with extra scales, flagstones that would sweat frost in the morning, squirrels stockpiling more nuts than usual, although I don't know how anybody could tell that. So lots of people agreed with this man and said, yes, there is going to be a very harsh upcoming winter, and it actually was. So I guess in this case, their observations did not lead them astray. Looking to Bermuda, they apparently have a very interesting tradition in which they use shark oil to predict what the weather is going to be. Now, the Bermuda Institute of Ocean Sciences tells us that this local tradition of using a little vial of shark oil has been in place for up to 300 years. And these barometers are very simple. It's just a little bit of oil extracted from a shark liver and sealed in glass. And, it can be a jar, an old wine bottle, or something fancier. And according to the believers of this particular prediction type, the devices are able to predict oncoming weather with pretty good accuracy, although there is debate on whether or not any of this is true at all. The way that it works is that there's some white sediment at the bottom of the bottles. And on days where the weather's going to be great, the oil will be clear. On overcast and rainy days, you'll find a little spiral or a little peak in the sediment. It's said that the oil will begin swirling as a hurricane approaches, and the way that sediment slopes can possibly show which direction it's coming from. Now, the oil doesn't just predict extreme weather. Smaller variations of, the peaks and the valleys on the sediment, or if there's crystal forming on the glass, those are believed to be predicting more subtle weather occurrences. Now, the belief is that this oil must be taken from a small shark known locally as puppy sharks, And ideally, you want to do that during the full moon. And apparently, the relationship between the efficiency of the oil and what phase the moon is in does mirror the changes in weather that come along with the shifting tides. So there may be some basis there, although, as I said, it is definitely debated. In addition to oils and animals predicting the weather, we also have a weather stick. And we find this in Vermont, in Maine, in Canada. And they're about 16 inches long. And it says that it will curl upward if there's good weather and curl downward if there's going to be rain or snow. Now, this stick is made from balsam fir, which is found in those areas I mentioned. And it's called reaction wood, and it's essentially strengthened wood fibers that form when a tree has to embrace itself against high winds regularly. And so there are a lot of trees like this, but with the balsam fir, things are a little bit different. They develop the stronger fibers on the underside of their branches, and the reason they do that is because the branches shrink in the dry weather in order to conserve water, and when the weather is wet, the fibers and the branches will expand and start to bend upward. So this means that on the actual tree, a twig pointing down would mean that the weather is sunny and dry. And if it's pointing up, it means it's humid or wet. And if you do make your own weather stick, or if you find a weather stick, you'll have to be very clear on the orientation of the stick if you're using it, because you'll have to know which direction it's curling and if that's up or down. We also see examples of people trying to prevent bad weather. And obviously, we have heard about rain dances and how people try to get through droughts that way. But a couple of other specific examples that I have about preventing bad weather. The first is in Louisville. And there is something called the witch tree, and that's on the corner of 6th Street and Park Avenue. And it's supposed to be this really twisted, hideous tree that is all bent and misshapen. On this tree, the local residents tie shiny things and hang bead necklaces and different trinkets from the branches. And the reason that they do this is to appease vengeful witches. Now, the story goes that in the late 19th century, this tree was a gathering place for a coven of witches, and they would perform their ceremonies and generally were not too much of a nuisance until a city planning committee decided that they were going to remove the tree ahead of their annual May Day celebration. And this upset the witches a lot. So much so that a curse was cast. And 11 months to the day after the tree was shut down, the city suffered a terrible storm. And people believed that this was the witch's curse, and they had summoned a storm demon. And because during the storm, lightning struck the stump of the old tree, and a new tree started growing there. And it was obviously not a healthy, happy tree, but rather this twisted, ugly tree, which is what made people believe that it was part of, what the witches had done. And that's why they still now go and tie fancy things and shiny things to keep the witches happy. Another way that people tried to prevent bad weather can be traced back to an Italian professor of mineralogy. And in 1880, he raised the notion that if you could inject smoke particles into thunderclouds in some way, you could prevent hail from actually forming. Fast forward to 1895, and there was an Austrian wine grower named Albert Steiger, and he started doing some backyard experiments, and he came up with this muzzle-loading mortar that pointed upward. And it was made of sheet metal and mounted on a wooden base. Now, when the cannon was fired, it would send a smoke ring going up about 300 meters. And the idea behind this being that the discharge, that smoke discharge, disturbed atmospheric motions and formed sort of a strong upward wind that altered the hail that was forming in approaching clouds. Now, the first year that he tested the cannon, the surrounding area experienced no hail. And so people got really interested in that, and they started building lots more. And then the following year, in 1897, there was again no hail. And so they started building tons of these. For example, in Venice, between 1899 and 1900, the number of cannons went from 466 to 1,630. And apparently there was even an International Hail Suppression Congress. And in 1902, they decided at this conference that the cannon's effectiveness was not proven or disproven. And so the Italian government in 1903 decided to arrange an experiment involving a couple hundred cannons that they fired off. And the result of that was that both testing areas that they used these cannons in experienced hail damage. And so the cannons were declared a failure, and within a few years, they had mostly gone out of use. So, how do you take some of this weather lore and incorporate it into your life? Obviously, you can observe some of the sayings I've given you here or others that you might have heard and just see if they actually turn out to be true, if they work, right? If you live in an area where you can get some balsam fir, you could always make yourself a weather stick and see if that works for you. Now, I said earlier when I talked about the onion divination that I was going to go through the process. So I'm going to go through that in a little bit of detail here. So the first step is you get yourself a nice round onion. It doesn't matter what color it is or where it's grown. Everyone has their different preferences on that. Next, you cut the onion in half lengthwise, and you carefully separate the 6 outermost layers so that you have 12 sections total. And you lay the sections out in 2 rows. The first should be January through June, with January being the outermost and June the innermost. The second half represents July through December, with July being the outermost layer and December the innermost. You add a teaspoon of salt in the center of each of these little onion cups, and then you let it sit overnight. And some people keep it inside, but a lot think that you need to put it outside to get the most accurate reading. And in the very early morning, around 5 a.m., bring the onion inside and jot down your readings before the inside temperatures change the result. And obviously this is a New Year's Eve tradition, New Year's morning, I guess. If you're able to get up at 5, that's the ideal time. And so, as I said earlier, the different conditions of each of the slices represent what those months are going to look at. So again, if it was dry, it would indicate that that month was going to be a drier month. And if there's liquid in the center, that might be heavy rain or snow. And caked salt could mean frost, and bubbles again hint at humidity. Now, the thing that is confusing to me about this is if you do put it outside to get a better reading, I'm not sure what would happen, because overnight where I live, they'd be frozen in the morning. And so I can't imagine you'd get all that accurate of information if the salt wasn't actually able to work on the onion, because it would freeze pretty quickly a lot of years here. So not quite sure how that is supposed to go. So maybe find a spot that's either inside or in a porch or somewhere that's kind of outdoor adjacent if you're in that situation. So that is all of the weather divination folklore that I have for you today. I hope that you enjoyed it. And don't forget that in addition to Facebook and Instagram, you can also now find us on Blue Sky at Folkloring Podcast. Thank you so much for listening, and please keep on folkloring.
As always, thanks for listening to Folkloring. If you liked what you heard, please consider leaving a rating and review, and don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast app so you never miss an episode. If you have any questions or comments, or would like to suggest a topic for a future episode, please email us at folkloringpod@gmail.com or message us on Facebook or Instagram. Other places you can find me are at the Folklore Podcast as the theater, film, and storytellers correspondent, or creating folklore-inspired games at madmenandheroes.com. Stay curious, stay connected, and keep the traditions alive. And I hope that wherever you are, folklore is making your life more magical.